Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Julia. Thanks, everybody, for coming out to hear this story. Before I start the story, first of all, can you all hear me well enough back there?
Yeah.
Before I start the story, I just want to set the scene and give a little background information about where we were and why we were there. So here's a map of Africa. We were here in West Africa in Sierra Leone, which is a tiny country on the west coast of Africa. This is a larger view of the country. This is Sierra Leone. It's about the size of South Carolina. So it's not a big country at all. When we were there in the late 90s, there were about 4 million people. The population was 4 million. It was one of the poorest nations in the world. Life expectancy was 39 and a half years old, and it had the highest infant mortality rate in the world. Interestingly, though, natural resources. It's very rich with natural resources: diamonds, gold, iron ore, bauxite, and that was part of the problem. And those being so rich with natural resources caused a lot of conflict and tremendous instability for that country. We, me, my husband, my children, were a foreign service family, US diplomats. My husband, Jeff, with our two sons, Jonathan and Michael, arrived in Freetown in late summer 1995 for a 2-year tour. We had just finished up a 3-year tour in Cairo, Egypt, and we were looking forward to this West African adventure. Freetown, Sierra Leone was listed by the US State Department as a hardship post. What that means is there's very little infrastructure. We had to bring our food, consumable items. The only thing we were guaranteed to eat there was fish and rice. So if there was anything else we needed to live, we had this huge many thousand-pound shipment of supplies that we had to send. There was a small international school for my children. Michael would be in grade 1. John was going into grade 4. And because of the troubles in Sierra Leone prior to when we were there, we were confined to the Freetown Peninsula. Freetown is right here on this peninsula. I know it's probably hard for you to see from way back there, but it's right out at the end of the peninsula. Freetown, like Camden, although not like Camden at all, has mountains, huge mountains, jungle, tropical, rainforest mountains that lead down to the ocean. So the mountains to the sea. And the peninsula was rimmed with white, beautiful beaches, and the city was down at the foot of the mountains. The US Embassy was in the downtown area. We lived on a US compound, residential compound, about 4 miles outside of downtown in the west end of the city. There were probably, I think, 8 families in our compound. There was another compound about a mile from us where our 7 US Marine security guards that were assigned to Embassy Freetown lived in their residential compound. And then there were a smattering, a few other residences in our general area. We were a small post, I'm not quite sure the number, but one of the smaller posts out there. We enjoyed our 2 years there. They were very challenging, but very rewarding at the same time. We were almost at the end of our tour. We had a month left when this little event happened. And I would like to just remind you that this was in 1997. So there was no internet and there was no cell phones. We used handheld radios. That was our only means of communication with each other. And the other thing that for me says a lot about the time, the late 90s, 9/11 had not happened yet. So it was a very, very different world than it is today. So with all of that background, I will tell you a story. So here we go. It was 6:30 in the morning on Sunday, May 25th, 1997. I was standing in my kitchen with a big bowl of pancake batter and a whisk in my hand. My family was still sleeping. I was going to surprise them with a pancake breakfast. And as I was whisking that bowl, I heard a gunshot. Now, that's not unusual. Gunshots, you hear them in Freetown, but you never hear them in the daylight. In the nighttime, you would hear them a lot in the dark, but you never heard them in the light of day. And I just listened, and I heard another one, and I heard another one. And I knew something was very off. So I headed from my kitchen all the way back towards the other side of the house to find my husband, who I believed was sleeping, wake him up and say, something's weird, something's going on here. But as I was walking back to him, he was coming out to me, and we met in the hallway, this long internal hallway in our home that connected the front of the house to the back of the house. And he had a radio in his hand, and I could hear transmissions coming through the radio, and I could hear more gunshots from outside. And all of a sudden, it was like this cacophony of sounds throughout my house on a Sunday morning. The radios were blaring, the telephone started ringing, the doorbell started ringing. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Michael and John, whose bedrooms were along that hallway, both had opened their doors and stuck their little heads out, like, what's happening? So we were all standing in the hall, Jeff with his radio in hand, transmissions coming through, what's going on, what's going on, what's happening? And then Jeff said in a very firm and stern voice, stay away from the windows. The only place that there were not windows in my house was in that hallway. He left us in the hallway. I shut all the doors. The boys sat down. Jeff went up to the front of the house to try to figure out what was going on. So the boys and I are in this little cocoon of a hallway with a fluorescent light up above. And I'm thinking, okay, this is going to blow over. Let me distract these children. I didn't want them to be too disturbed about this. So I went into John's room. I grabbed a clue game. I brought it out into the hall. I set up the game of Clue. I brought some pillows for us to sit on. We were going to have a little game in the hall at 7 in the morning. It lasted 10 minutes. We could hear the gunshots more and more. We could hear Jeff, the voices, the radios, the telephone. And we just gave up on the game. We all backed up against the wall in that hallway, drew our knees in towards our chest, and we just sat there. One boy on my right, one boy on my left. And we just listened, and we waited. And we were very clueless as to what was happening. We sat like that for a while. And then at some point, curiosity got the better of me. I left the boys there, and I went out to the other part of the house to see if Jeff had any information that he could tell me about what was happening. And he did. He said that at 6 o'clock that morning, one of our US Marine security guards that was on his way to work from his residence, he was on his way from his residence down into the downtown area to the Chancery, the US Embassy, to do his shift, had been hijacked, carjacked at gunpoint by rogue Sierra Leonean army soldiers that were dressed in uniform, but wearing red t-shirts over their uniform. He was still captive, and they didn't know anything more than that. Well, my stomach dropped because these 7 Marines, these 19 and 20-year-old young men, were a part of our family. They were big brothers to my children. They had many, many nights. They were dinner guests at our home. We spent many weekends at their house watching movies and playing tennis and having pool parties. And I was just stunned. And then Jeff told me that gunfire in all the residential neighborhoods of Freetown was increasing, and especially in the West End. The West End was where we lived. And it was where there were a lot of diplomatic families and a lot of expatriate families. And we lived smack dab in the middle of the West End. So I tried to digest this information, but I didn't want to let go of the notion that this is just going to all blow over. Just given enough time, it would go away. I grabbed some bananas, gave up on the pancakes, and brought the bananas back to the hall for the boys. They didn't want to eat the bananas, neither did I. I grabbed Yahtzee, I grabbed Uno. I just wanted to keep them distracted. They did not want to be distracted by games. So we kind of just sat there, and I wasn't sure what I should do for them. And before too long, Jeff stuck his head back into that hallway, and he said, "Come on out, I need to talk to you." I went back out to the front part of the house, and he said, "The Marine security guard has been released. He was dumped out of the car at the US Embassy downtown, but not before he was held at gunpoint and forced to drive around the streets of Freetown, picking up and dropping off rogue Sierra Leonean soldiers wearing red t-shirts and dropping that at various locations throughout the city." And he also told me we'd gotten word that the president of Sierra Leone had fled the country. So then it was very obvious, it was very clear that a coup d'etat, an insurrection, was underway. The government had been overthrown by a group of rogue army soldiers. And then he shared yet another piece of information. The insurrectionists went to the center of town where the Pandemba prison was located. The insurrectionists released all 700 inmates, gave them red t-shirts, red hats, and red bandanas, armed them, and set them loose to just join in the mayhem that was happening. Set them loose to pillage, to rape, to kill. Just cause as much destruction as possible. And on top of that, word was trickling back that the vast majority of the Sierra Leonean army was siding with the coup leaders. And they donned their red shirts. And it was mayhem. And it was crazy. Gunshots were constant. And with the inclusion of the soldiers from the army, the weaponry, there were reverberations throughout the city, larger weapons, more explosions. So it was escalating. Our radios were relaying information nonstop from our neighbors and their contacts, and our telephone was inundated with phone calls from our neighbors, our friends, our community, the expat community, Indians and Lebanese and Europeans and Americans, and everybody just wanted to know, what can I do? What should I do? What's happening? What do I need to do? It was panic. It was just pure panic. Home invasions began. People were beaten. People were murdered. Women were raped, and the homes were looted. Jeff asked if I could man the phone. He needed to go up on the roof. We had a big flat top roof on the top of our house. so they could, with his colleagues, and to see if they could get some perspective of what was happening in the streets. He went up on the roof. I was answering phones, trying to advise people. And I just yo-yoed back and forth between the phone and the boys back in the secluded hallway. I didn't do a good job on either of these fronts, but I did my best. And at some point, I got the TV going with the VCR, and I got out the Lion King, and I threw it into the VCR, and my boys watched the Lion King on repeat for a long time. Hakuna Matata, no worries. That's all I hoped for them, really. It was probably noon. I mean, the day just deteriorated. The coup leaders had gained control of the State House, the state-run radio. Government buildings in the downtown were set afire. Businesses, banks, schools, everything was set ablaze. The US Embassy was hit with RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and RPOs, manned portable rocket launchers. And then the military weapons and ammunition depot that was on the other side of town was overrun, and all those weapons, all that military equipment was just passed out to the men in the red t-shirts. And it was just chaos. All you had to do was put on a red bandana and you could join everybody in the streets and just tear it up. It was crazy. And this went on for hours. And then it was our turn. It was mid-afternoon, and the rebels were at our gate. They were trying to climb over our walls. Our compounds were surrounded by large 14, 16-foot brick thick concrete walls, and with barbed wire all around the top. But they were trying to get into our compound. By now, we had donned our Kevlar vests and our army helmets. And my poor little boys, I mean, they were down to their ankles. I mean, those vests weighed more than they did. And Jeff was preparing to go outside to confront the rebels. He had a handgun. We had our vests on. And he locked us in a closet. He left. And I remember thinking, I don't know if we'll see him again. So the boys and I sat in that dark closet, and I have no idea how long we were in there. I really don't. And we were so quiet. We were barely breathing. I didn't know little boys could be that quiet. But they were. And at some point while we were in the closet, we heard an explosion. And that's when my heart sank. And I didn't know if we'd even ever get out of that closet. But after what seemed like forever, Jeff came back and let us out. That explosion we heard were the rebels blowing open our car gate. Somehow, Jeff talked them out of coming in. He gave them a vehicle, he gave them some money, and he convinced them to leave. He buttoned up the gate, and we were the luckiest people in Freetown because many of our friends and neighbors were not lucky at all. The violence continued and it escalated. People hid in bathrooms and attics and elevator shafts, anywhere they could just lock themselves away. Homes were looted. 5, 10, 15. I knew people whose homes were looted 20 times by roving bands of insurrectionists. First, they would take the valuable stuff. Then they would start taking anything, and just round after round. And by the end of that day, they were taking the doors off the hinges and they were unscrewing the light bulbs from the ceiling. Everything was destroyed and stolen. At some point that afternoon, a decision was made by the people in our residential compound that we all needed to be in one place all together so that we were all accounted for. So we grabbed a few things. We were going to walk down this little hill within our compound, and we we're all going to be in somebody else's home. We grabbed things, we walked down to this other residence, all of us, all family members and families. We were a ragtag bunch, but we were together and we were all accounted for. And then our mission was to make some contact with the outside world because we had no contact with the outside world. There was a telephone, but again, infrastructure in Freetown was really poor, and it took forever to get a phone call through to Washington, D.C., to the US State Department. But we did, we got through. And the minute we got through, we made up a schedule, 24 hours around the clock. We would never hang up that phone. We had 2-hour shifts that we would be on the phone, just listening, sharing, passing information, because we had no other means of communication. That was it, one phone line. Stress levels were very, very high. Even though there were so many people in this residence, there was no chit chat. Unless you had something to share or something to say of importance, everybody was pretty quiet. The children were all tucked in a back room watching videos. That was it. We just tried to keep them away from the adult conversation. We didn't want them to hear a lot of the things that were being said. I don't know how much they did hear. I don't know how much they comprehended. But I do know that I'm sure they just absorbed the fear and the stress in that home just through osmosis. Sunday night, nightfall came. We were exhausted, but nobody slept. And then there was a huge, huge tropical storm with thunder and lightning and torrential rain. It was quite a day. And then it was Monday, day 2. We just were kind of waiting. What do we do? What's happening? And we got a bit of good news. This was a bit of really, really good news. By some stroke of luck, there was a US Army Special Forces unit, 11 US Army soldiers, somewhere out here. And we're up here in Freetown, about 40 miles. And let me tell you, this is 40 long miles. There are no real roads to speak of. But they got permission from the Department of Defense to make their way to Freetown, to us. No easy task, but if anybody was up to that challenge, it was a unit of special forces. And boy, did we anxiously await their arrival. We knew it would take a while, but we were standing there with open arms ready for them. Meanwhile, Monday wore on, and expatriates, other Americans and Lebanese and Europeans, everybody, showed up at our compound. Our compound and the British Embassy compound, which was a couple of miles away from us, were the only 2 places in the whole city that hadn't been breached and destroyed. We were safe for the moment. And everybody just flocked to us with nothing but the shirts on their back. And I remember there were some poor souls that didn't even have shirts. So they showed up at our gates and we welcomed them with open hearts. And since John, Michael, Jeff, and I were no longer living at our house, we were down at the other residence with the rest of the embassy folks, this growing contingent of people seeking shelter were given our home. And I think by the end of Monday, there were at least 40 or 50 people living at our house. And their stories were horrific, the things they had been through, what they had experienced. And yet they were so grateful to be safe. They'd been through so much more than we had. And the women that were sheltering, a magnificent group of women. They gathered food, what little there was, from all the different residences, and they made it their mission to just cook and feed everybody on that compound. We all did what we could. We leaned on each other and we lifted each other up. And if somebody was crumbling, and boy, did some people crumble, there was somebody there to give words of encouragement or a much needed hug. Despite what was going on, there were still many beautiful moments. And then just before nightfall on Monday, those special forces arrived, those 11 US Army soldiers. And I think we all breathed a little bit easier Monday night. Tuesday morning, the sun came up. Again, I don't think anybody had slept more than an hour here, maybe an hour there. So we were stressed and now we're sleep deprived. Never a good combination, but that's the way it was. We, Jonathan, Michael, and I needed to go back up to our home to gather up some clean clothes and a few toys and books for the kids. So we left the temporary residence and we kind of darted up to our residence. And when we were outside, we ran into this Army captain, a young Army captain, Captain Francis Baudet. And we did our introductions. And I'm sure he could sense that we were in a bad way. So he took the boys and showed them the Humvees. There were 2 Humvees there. They had come down from the jungle with. And he let the boys climb through the Humvees. And he let them sit in the driver's seat. And then he said to me, "Would you and the boys like to come up to the roof? I want to show you something." And I said, "Sure." So we entered that building. We climbed up lots of stairs. And we walked out onto this open expanse, this flat-topped roof. And I was really blown away. I felt like I'd walked out onto some sort of a movie set. There were soldiers. There were weapons that I have no idea how to describe them or what they were, but they had set up an immense defensive position on the top of this flat top roof of one of our residences. And then Captain Baudet, this Army captain, if he was 30, I don't even know. He may not have even been a 30-year-old man yet. He was a young man. And he knelt down. He knelt down on the ground. He knelt down on the ground in front of my boys. He looked them in the eye and he said, "Boys, John, Michael, you do not have to worry. I will take care of you." Sorry. And then he said, and don't you worry, because I'm going to take care of your mom and I'm going to take care of your dad. And you're going to be okay. So you can go back downstairs and you don't have to worry. You just have to know that we are going to take care of you. It was probably one of the most beautiful gestures I've ever seen. And the fact that this young man knew to do that, I was very moved, and I'll never forget that. So it hits Tuesday. We've been to the roof. Our hearts are feeling a little stronger, knowing that these soldiers are there. Tuesday and Wednesday were not as violent as the previous days had been. But if it's even possible, those days were more filled with tension and stress. And this is why. You see, the nature of a coup, the nature of insurrection, is once it has achieved its goal through violence, through chaos, it then has to confront the obvious next question. And the next question is, now what? Now what? So as the coup leaders were off grappling with their next steps, which we had no idea what those next steps would be, we all clustered together in this one residence. We're putting our heads together, trying to figure out our next steps and whatever those might be. So during those 2 days, the diplomats at U.S. Embassy Freetown started formulating their own plan. And again, as luck would have it, and I tell you, luck was on our side. Approximately 3,000 miles south of Freetown. Freetown is here, about 3,000 miles south, down in this area, off the coast of the Congo, was the USS Kearsarge. That is a US Navy amphibious assault vehicle. No, ship, I'm sorry. A US Navy amphibious assault ship. On that ship were 1,100 US naval officers. And on board that ship was the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, which consisted of over 2,000 Marines. Wow. Yeah. And at some point, upon hearing about what was happening with us and our trouble, that ship began its journey towards us up in Freetown. Again, it was about a 2,500, 3,000 mile journey. They were on their way. And now the US Department of Defense, along with the State Department, and along with the diplomats in Freetown and our one phone line to the outside world, started to hatch a plan to evacuate. And the USS Kearsarge would play a large role in getting us out of there. As it stood at that moment, all family members, non-essential staff would be evacuated. A very small core group of embassy employees would stay behind, along with our 7 Marine guards, US Marine guards. Diplomatic ties with Sierra Leone would remain in place. And that's what we were planning for. So Jeff would be staying in Freetown. The boys and I would be evacuated. And the operation had a name. You know you're in deep trouble when the US military decides to give your situation a name. We were called Operation Noble Obelisk. I have no idea why. The next step was for the US Embassy, the core group of the US Embassy, to begin negotiations with the rebels, because in order to have an evacuation, you have to have safe passage for the helicopters, which are many, to come into Freetown to airlift people and bring them back. They couldn't do that without some sort of an agreement or a time frame upon which that could happen. The plan was that the USS Kearsarge should be off the coast of Freetown, Sierra Leone, by Friday, and it would be on the horizon, so nobody would know it's out there. And the helicopters, of which there were many, would come in and airlift people from the beaches out to the ship. And the ship, once it was full of people that needed to be evacuated, would cruise up the coast to Conakry, Guinea, which was a relatively short journey. Now, the negotiations to make this happen were the hard part. It was tense, it was dicey. Embassy employees had to go down to rebel headquarters, and they had to leave the compound. Special forces soldiers accompanied them. And they came back with reports that the coup leaders were losing control of the insurrectionists. There was a lot of intoxication from alcohol and drugs. A lot of people had joined the fight just to be destructive and loot, and it was quite chaotic. Secretly, some of the Sierra Leonean leaders prior to the overthrow approached the US Embassy staff and asked, if there is an evacuation, could we please go to? That's how bad it was. Question, who was in charge? Second question was, who could you trust? Yeah, these were the people they had to negotiate with if we had any hopes of getting out. I just spent those 2 days trying to convince myself that everything was going to work out. It just was going to work out. Thursday morning, late morning, around 11-ish, I took a call. The call was from Colin Glass at the British Embassy. He's the Deputy Chief of Mission for the British Embassy in Sierra Leone. The Brits, like us, were hunkered down in their compound trying to figure out what they were going to do, what their next steps were. Colin called to tell the Americans that the British had arranged for a 747, a charter 747, to land at Freetown International Airport that afternoon. It would evacuate British women and children, European Union women and children, flying them to London. He said, we have about 12 or 15 seats that we can give to American women and children. He told me helicopters would be shuttling people to the airport from the Cape Sierra Hotel. There was no way to access the airport. The airport was off peninsula. The only way to get to the airport was a ferry. The ferries were not operating, or a helicopter. And then he said we would have to make our own arrangements to get from our compound down to the helipad to get a ride to the airport. For us, that would be about a 4 or 5 mile journey. I told Colin I would pass along the information about his offer, and I would get back to him shortly with the US Embassy response. Now, I am not a spontaneous person. I am the opposite of a spontaneous person. But the moment that call ended with Colin Glass, I made up my mind. I would be on that plane to London with my children that afternoon. And there were 3 hours to make it happen. But Jeff was off compound, negotiating with the rebels for the US military evacuation. And I had to find him to give him the Colin's information, but also to tell him that I was ready to go. I've never been so ready to do anything in my life. So the only way to communicate with Jeff is a handheld radio. Handheld radio is an open network. That means everybody in our community could hear every conversation. We knew what everybody was having for dinner every night. We knew everything about everybody. It was the biggest bubble life that you could ever imagine. But I had to give this information. So I radioed to Jeff. I told him about Colin's offer. I told him about the aircraft. And then I told him if it were at all possible, the boys and I, we needed to be on that plane. He said he'd get back to me. I'm sure he had to confer with his colleagues. And it wasn't too long before he did get back to me. And he said, we will make it happen. Be ready to leave at 2:00. Which at this point was maybe 2.5 hours. Let me tell you, it did not take but 5 minutes to fill up the seats on that airplane, because of course everybody's listening to the radio network, and I quickly had the list of names, moms and children. I got back to Colin Glass. I gave him our names. I told him we would be down at the Cape Sierra Hotel to get on a helicopter shuttle shortly after 2:00. And then we had to get ready to go. Again, the boys and I darted back up to our residence. Now, I always had a to-go bag packed for the boys. It was standard operating procedure to always have your kids ready to roll. And you were supposed to be ready too, but of course I wasn't. My kids were ready, but I wasn't. So we got their stuff in their backpacks. And I said, now go in your rooms and see if you can fit in a toy or a book or whatever you want to take for this journey. I double checked that I had the paperwork. That's really all I cared about, that I had the passports, I had the immunization records, I had the medical records, I had the school records, I had copies of everything. And then I had those 40, 50 people in my home. And I needed to tell them that we were leaving. And that was hard. So I approached my friend Hala, a lovely, gracious Lebanese woman. And I told her about the 747, that it was leaving. We would be leaving at 2. And I kept assuring her that she would get out soon, within a few days. But I felt really bad that we were leaving. And we were leaving all these people behind. She was beautiful. She just looked at me and said, are you ready to go? And I said, look, the boys are ready. I've got them packed. I said, I just got to go in. All we can bring is a carry-on. So I've got my carry-on. I just got to throw some clothes in there. And she so gently and kindly put her hands on my shoulders and looked at me. And she said, Denise, you're going to London. You don't need to bring clothes. And I said, I mean, and again, this is day 5. We have not slept in 5 days. And then you had the stress. We were kind of like crazy. And I said, what, Hala? They're not wearing clothes in London these days? You know, what's happening? And she laughed and I laughed. And then she very sweetly, kindly said to this naive American woman, you never have had to flee before. You don't bring clothes when you're fleeing. You need to bring the things that are important to you, the things that mean something to you, the things that you would never want to lose. And I said, Hala, do not worry. Jeff is staying. He's going to pack the house out. He'll get everything shipped home. Not a problem. And she listened to me. And then she reiterated her thoughts. And she took my hand and we walked through my home. And she picked up baby pictures and wedding pictures. We cruised through the dining room and she picked up some candlesticks, silver candlesticks. She says, what's the story here? And I said, that was a wedding gift. She goes, let's take those. And so we retreated back to the other end of the house with our arms full and placed everything in this carry-on bag that was laid open on the bed. And then she said, now you throw in a change of clothes and maybe a pair of pajamas, and then you're good. You're ready. So she left. I threw a few things in my bag, zipped it up, rolled it out to the front of the house. The boys were there, their backpacks and their little toys and their little books, whatever. And it was almost 2 o'clock. It was time to go. So we said goodbye. And those goodbyes were hard. They were heartfelt. They were tearful. And I knew I would never see a lot of those people ever again, ever. It was 2. We were ready. And we ventured down to the compound parking lot, bags in hand, ready to leave the compound, ready to leave the safety of those great big tall walls, ready to leave the safety of those soldiers on the roof. I was turning inside at the thought of stepping outside of this almost sacred space. But what I saw in the parking lot amazed me again. There was a Humvee. There was a white Suburban and another white Suburban, and followed up by a Humvee. So the special forces soldiers were going to take us down to the helipad, and they were going to make sure we got there without a problem. They loaded us into the vehicles. I sat behind the driver, next to the window. Michael's next to me, and John was next to him. All the evacuees were loaded in the cars. And I was so grateful to Jeff for arranging this for us. And it was bittersweet because we couldn't say goodbye to him because he was still at Rebel headquarters. And then off we went. The gate opened, we went out, we lived on the foothills leading up to the mountains. So the drive is just downhill, downhill, downhill towards the ocean. And then another amazing thing, out of nowhere, out of absolutely nowhere, 2 US Navy helicopters from that Kearsarge, which was out there somewhere, came flying and hovered over us all the way down to our destination. So I'm in that car and I'm looking up at the bottom of the biggest war machine I've ever seen flying overhead with missiles on the sides. And it was the most humbling experience because just the privilege that was afforded me, my children, and those other evacuees. It was just so humbling. I gazed out the windows during the ride and it was just destruction. Buildings had been burnt. There was just, all these looted goods were just strewn everywhere in the streets. There were bloodstains. Every piece of glass in every building was broken. It was a chilling sight. And little Michael next to me, he said to me, "Mommy, just close your eyes." And I said, "Why, Mike? Why? Why should I close my eyes?" And this little boy who had just finished the 2nd grade said to me, "If you can't see them, they can't see you. And if they can't see you, they can't kill you." And I just hugged him a little tighter. And then we pulled into our designated area down at the Cape Sierra Hotel. And those 2 Navy helicopters that had been overhead the whole way just flew faster than anything I've seen out over the ocean towards the horizon, and they were gone. We got out of the car. We thanked the special forces so much, profusely. And we turned ourselves over to the care of the British. It was a British operation. This was their show. And I put my complete faith in them. They led us to a long line of women and children waiting to get on the next helicopter. And before too long, this huge Russian helicopter, ancient Russian helicopter, came down onto the helipad. It could hold about 30 people. It was a Russian helicopter that had been used in earlier times to shuttle troops around. So we got in there, and there were benches lined up all around the walls of the interior of that aircraft. And we sat there on the benches, backs against the wall, our little bags in front of us on the floor, and there were hanging straps, like you see on a New York City subway. There were no seatbelts, so we're hanging on to straps and we're hanging on to our bags, and the helicopter lifts us up. Off we go over to the airport. It's only about a 7 or 8 minute flight, but we go up over the water and down to the airport. We get out, they shuttled us out and brought us into the terminal building. And again, terminal building, I think of it more as a hangar. We came in big, wide, tall doors in a cavernous space. There were a lot of women and children loitering around, waiting, or sitting on their cases, waiting, and we joined them. And then out the other side of the building, those doors were wide open too, and you could see the tarmac. And it wasn't long, maybe an hour, more people were being shuttled over, and then they quickly just lined us all up. We got in a line with our bags, one child on either side. It was time to go. I could see the 747 off in the distance on the tarmac. I would say it was at least 100 yards, maybe more. And we would walk across the tarmac to the plane. The air stairs had already been rolled over. I could see the stairs. That was our destination. That's where we were headed. The line was moving slowly. They were letting just a couple of family groups go at a time. I think they wanted to keep distance so that people didn't get clustered at the bottom of those air stairs. And as we get closer to the front of the line, I was watching, that's what I do. I was just watching the British handlers, the people that were coordinating this. And I could sense an intense stress, concern. They were very agitated. And I wasn't sure why. I just chalked it up to a lot of bad days. And they probably just wanted to get this done and over with. It was our turn. We're at the front of the line. So we stepped out of the terminal, onto the tarmac, into the light of the afternoon. And within a split second, I understood that tension, that palpable tension that I felt in that terminal area. So I gazed to my right, and from the tail of that 747 all the way up to the terminal was a long line of rebel soldiers and pickup trucks and army vehicles. They were all wearing their red t-shirts, their red hats, their red bandanas. Their AK-47s were on their shoulders. They were aiming straight ahead. The RPGs on the backs of the trucks, everything was, they were in go mode. And I looked the other way to see what they were pointing at. And from the nose of the plane all the way back to the terminal was another row of uniformed Sierra Leonean officers and men, soldiers, obviously still loyal to somebody. I don't know. It was immediately obvious to me that there was going to be a fight for the airport, control of the airport. That's a big deal. He who controls the airport controls a lot. I just said to the boys, in the meanest, sternest voice I could find, keep your eyes on that airplane, those stairs, Just walk to the airplane, stare, don't take your eyes off that airplane. I did not want them to see what was on their right and what was on their left. And as we made that walk of about 100 yards, I knew that one false move by anybody would be a disaster. We got to the stairs. We climbed up the stairs. A lovely flight attendant greeted us and quickly, expeditiously, just brought us to 3 seats. And within less than a minute, she had us buckled in and she stowed our bags. And there was not a sound on that aircraft except for the voices of those flight attendants getting people into their seats. We weren't there in our seats but for 10 minutes, and the plane revved up and it started to roll. And then it started to go faster, and it actually started to lift up off the ground to take flight. And we lifted up, and then we had to bank to go north. And as the plane banked, I looked out my window and I looked down at the tarmac at the airport, and there was a firefight on the ground. I could see the explosions. I could see the fire coming out of the end of the rocket propelled grenades. And it was a total fight for the airport. And then we went up into the clouds, and it was a plane load of women and children. There was no celebration. It was the quietest flight I've ever been on. And 8 hours later, we landed in the very, very wee hours of the morning, Friday morning, at Gatwick Airport in London. And we were greeted by US Embassy London staff, so our counterparts that were serving in London. They gathered up our US evacuees, and I remember being herded to some sort of a minibus. And I remember there was CNN, and there were cameras, and there were microphones being shoved in our faces, and it was very surreal. We got on the minibus. I don't remember going through customs or immigration or anything. I don't know how they did that. And they brought us to an airport hotel. And we got into the airport hotel, and there was one of those meeting rooms, like a room like this. And they had doctors, counselors, first aid, food, clothing, anything you could imagine. They even gave us money. They thought of everything. We were assigned a handler, a beautiful young woman who had the key to a room. And before we all left to find our place of rest for the night, we were told that when we were at the airport, and then during that flight to London, those 8 hours or so, that the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, now that is a very brutal and notorious rebel group that had been driven off the Freetown Peninsula some years before. Well, learning of all the problems in Freetown, they had decided that they were coming back to see if perhaps they could gain some power or some control. The US government decided the situation in Freetown was now untenable. US diplomatic ties would be cut. Everybody would be evacuated. Jeff would not be staying, the Marines, nobody was staying. The embassy was going to go through a destruction mode. It was going to be shut down. The terminology we use is we were taking down the flag. It was over. And everything was lost. We went upstairs to our room. Again, our room was full of everything that you could need for little boys, for tired women. And the woman that accompanied us gave me a laminated card with some phone numbers on it. And she said, if you need anything, call these numbers. They will be downstairs for you all night. And she said, I will be back at 9 in the morning and we'll see what you need. The boys, I got them in bed. They went to sleep, like flat out. I just sat there and watched them sleep because they were safe. And we had made it out. And then the very next day, the official US military evacuation of Freetown began. It was a massive operation. It was underway. And over the next few days, 3,400 battered and broken humans were lifted from the beaches of Freetown out to the USS Kearsarge, and then cruising up and delivered safely to open arms in Conakry, Guinea. Jeff played a massive role in getting us out and a massive role in getting those 3,400 people out. Within a few days, 4 or 5 days maybe, we were all safe and all together again back in Washington, D.C. We had lost everything except what we have in the carry-on. But we had each other. And we were all in one piece, more or less. We were good. I can't say the same for the country of Sierra Leone and the poor people that remained there. The country descended into a civil war that lasted for 5 very long years. It was a brutal and horrific civil war. It was the war of the child soldiers and amputated limbs. 50,000 people were killed. 200,000 people were barbarically maimed, and 2 million people were displaced, all in this little country the size of South Carolina with a population of 4 million people. In a week's time, our life that we've been living for the past 2 years, it vanished. It was gone. The places that we frequented, where we lived our lives, where we worked, where we played, where we schooled, where we gathered, everything was gone. It was burned. It was destroyed. And more than that, the people, our community, our friends, our chosen families of all nationalities had scattered to the wind, finding their own way out. In 1 week's time, our life as we knew it ceased to exist. But what I'll always remember about that most horrible experience is not the darkness, not the horrific violence, not the worst that humanity has to offer. What I'll remember about that week are the endless, endless gestures of kindness, compassion, support, light, and love that kept us going. It kept us going and provided us with the will to find our way out. Thank you.
Questions, I just would like to say that Denise Breed is here. Survivors, one and all. Twice grown anyone. So, does anybody have any questions? We're happy to entertain whatever you can speak up, so we can try to get it on the Zoom. But Denise will repeat any questions. Anybody have any questions?
This may sound like a silly question, but with all that going on, how did they negotiate to get a 747 to land there?
You'd have to ask the British government.
British wit.
Yeah.
That was amazing. That one. I mean,
Yeah.
all the whole thing.
I know it was a chartered aircraft out of France. Corsair, I think, was the name of the company. I don't know how they did it. Yes.
Was there ever any worry about running out of food?
Oh, yes. Yes.
I mean, you have to,
We consolidated everything. We didn't know what happened. I mean, I didn't put this in the story, but and I like to think it's because we are who we are as Americans. We opened our doors to anybody that could get to us. We would bring them in. The Brits, God bless them, they got us out. And I understand why, but they took the other position because they didn't know, nobody knew how long this was going to go on. So they did not allow anybody onto their compound. And that was a contentious issue amongst some of the people there. But yes, we just gathered up all the food from the 8 residences within our compound and did the best that we could. Because we had to ship so much food over, like we had a consumable shipment, so we had tons and tons of staples. I mean, I can't say we're eating lots of green food, but there was a lot of pasta and rice and things that people had in their residences. Yes.
How did you know who to negotiate with? My husband's family is from Iran and they dealt with the same kind of evacuation in '79. How do you know who to trust to negotiate with? I mean, that would have been so amazingly scary for me. How do you know where Jeff is going? How do you know he's speaking to the right people?
You don't know.
I know, it's just.
You don't know.
shocking.
There's so much of this is a crapshoot.
Mhm.
You do the best you can
And you hope he comes.
and you hope it comes out okay. And I think that was, I think on that Thursday when I took that call from Colin Glass at the British Embassy, I was at the point where if there was any way I could get out, I was getting out.
Mhm.
I didn't want to wait another day or two. And I think a lot for the reason that you bring up, because there are so many unknowns. Anything could happen. It was a tinderbox. It was unpredictable.
Yeah.
And that's why I threw my lot in and said, I'm going.
Days that it'll settle down. And the new leaders will emerge. They'll bubble to the top, and that's who you go after, negotiate with.
So you're working with we have a son who's in special forces. So you were working with special forces and they were directing you? Did they know, did they have inside information that they were feeding you, or how does that
No,
work?
they were on a training mission with these guys when they did this.
Okay.
And they came into us and then we put all the assets together.
Okay,
Diplomatically, we figured out who the new leaders were. And then we did the negotiation with them, along with the British High Commission, British Embassy. They also were a critical part in negotiating how to get things settled back down.
Yeah.
So we can get people out.
I just can't imagine what your nervous system is doing right now. To retell the story.
It's pretty busy.
Absolutely.
It's pretty busy. Yes.
How was it determined which women and children would get on the plane?
Another interesting question.
What?
You're first in line.
It was an interest, we had 3 hours. All right. And I was determined. I can be determined. Not spontaneous, but I can be determined. But we did get a bit of pushback from our government in Washington, D.C. that we were not allowed to go with the Brits. They wanted us to go with our own country. And we said, what you gonna do? I shouldn't say this, but I'm being recorded, right? It was 26 years ago. I don't work for them anymore. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on Does that answer your question?
Well, was it just whoever got there?
We had,
Not the initial one was just the 747 left. The next day, 1,000 people came, and it was all third country nationals, other embassies, UN, all those other people. That's who we took out on the second run. It got even worse. We turned around, we came back down to Freetown, and we took anybody with a foreign passport. We took Iranians. We opened the door for everybody. Threw them on the ship, and we sailed north to Conakry, started the shuttle, put them onto land,
just brought them to safety,
Yeah.
yeah. Yes,
I know this is a story that you haven't really shared all these years. Could you share with us what made you want to tell this story now?
you are the fifth. This is the fifth time I've ever told this story. And the first time I told it was probably in 2018. So I didn't speak of this for, what is that, 20 years? Yeah, 20 years. I mean, maybe bits and pieces, but I just put it way over there. I don't know what happened. I mean, I have my inklings of why it bubbled up. When I got back to the States, that 4 or 5 days after we got the flight out of Freetown to London, I got back to America and I was on solid ground and I was in the safest place in the world. And I just felt that I didn't have anything to worry about anymore. I put that story away. That stuff doesn't happen here. It happens there, wherever there is. And fast forward 20 some odd years. And I think it just started bubbling up for various reasons. And I was a crazy lady the first time I told the story. I was driving a car with two people that I barely knew. They were friends of friends. We had about an hour's drive. They must have asked me a question. And the first thing I just started telling them this story. I'd never told this story to anybody, and I'm telling it to these two people from Dallas, Texas that I barely knew. And we drove to wherever we were going to meet some other people that we were meeting. We got to the parking lot and they wouldn't let me out of the car. They said, no, you got to finish the story. That was the first time I told the story. And that was in maybe 2018. And then 2019, I was driving a dear friend of mine from Rockport to Portland to catch a flight. She needed a flight back home. She's from Texas as well. And we're in the car, and I don't know why. I don't know why it happens in cars. And I'm driving to Portland, and I started telling her the story. And I never shut up the whole way from Rockport. We pull into the terminal, ready to get her car out of the back. And she looked at me and she said, I've known you for 20 years. Why have I never heard this story? And I said, because nobody's heard this story. Yeah. And then I since told 2 other people, and now I've told you. So, yes, I'll get back to you in 1 second. Yes.
I just would like to ask if your boys have any part of this story that they would like to share, because I think, how old were they when they were involved?
8, 7, 7 and 9, 7 and 10,
Probably a 10 or
10. I think you were 10. Anyway, yeah.
I just wondered what effect it's had on them in their lifetimes that they might share.
I mean, I think it was the early recognition of privilege. I remember leaving thinking I get to leave because I'm white, and being a 12-year-old, that was a pretty early recognition of difference between, social class, race, wealth. That was something that I've always considered.
I remember the funny things about it.
I'm sure you do.
I remember that I forgot to pack underwear. So we got to London, I had no underwear.
You can blame that on me. I'm your mom. You were just a
I
kid.
remember we get to sit on that airplane in first class And I was like, this is pretty awesome.
That was the flight from London to DC, the first class
Oh, was
flight.
it?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's okay though. We did. And you were quite blown away by that first class scene.
The other thing would be is, what did Jeff feel that day that you left?
You know, it was
Jeff, could you speak up a little?
Speak up.
kind of surreal. You know, once I knew that plane was in the air and it had taken off and was gone and, you know, made it to London and was like, yes, we're good this. We just turned focus back onto, because we got a huge mission in here. We're gonna take 2,500 people and then come back and get another couple thousand people and take them out of here. So you got consumed right back into it. You get drawn back into it. We were out running around the streets and you know, it was quite intense because it just, you couldn't let off the throttle. I mean, there was nothing. There's nothing you could really do. But it was something.
Well, they could probably give you one less thing to worry about.
Yeah, that's what I assumed. It was probably good that we were gone. He didn't have to worry about us
No, it was
anymore.
very good that they were gone. Matter of fact, I was the one that took the phone call from Washington, told him, take the family members off the plane. He's like, yeah, sure. However, you know, there was a chance there because there was a standoff at the airport that we could have avoided if we just stayed here. That was tough. And that plane got hit by a round.
It did, yeah. I didn't mention that.
They found a bullet hole in the plane.
Yeah.
They caught one while I was taking off, so.
I'll tell you something else weird that happened that I didn't put into the story. When we were in London, the boys were asleep. I'm in that hotel room. And I'm safe. I'm tired. I opened up that carry-on that had my baby pictures and my wedding pictures and my candlesticks and my change of clothes and my pajamas.
Yeah.
What I found in that suitcase, and this goes to my state of mind. There were 2 bathing suits, a black one and a navy blue one, and 2 pairs of high heels. I needed to get out of that country. I mean, it really, that's what it does to you. I thought, I was like, going to the Miss America pageant? I don't know why I packed that. I have no idea. It was insane. Yes.
Is it safe to assume you didn't do any other adventures after this?
Oh, no, we did. We did. Yeah, we did many after that.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where else have you?
We went to Doha, Qatar in the Persian Gulf. We were there for the coal bombing in Yemen, and then we were there for 9/11. So we were in the Middle East during 9/11, so we had a totally different perspective on all that. And the Iraq War. Yeah, we were there for the start of the Iraq War and the build up for the Iraq War. After that, I think we went to Turkey, maybe Germany, and Kenya. I did go back to Africa. Yeah, so yeah, we weren't deterred. I mean, we were deterred for a little bit, but yes.
I just wondered if you were able to reconnect with a couple of the people that were in your story, like the young soldier who knelt on the roof with you and
Well,
talked
let
to
me
the
just
kids.
tell you, let me stay near the microphone. Let me tell you, because that's another piece of the story. I mean, there's so much more to this story. So fast forward 12 years, maybe, Jeff and I are living in Germany. John's gone off to college. Michael's off at high school. We were in a little Italian restaurant in Stuttgart, Germany, on the US European Command base there.
I was assigned to the military at that time. I did an excursion with the military doing evacuations. We were based in Germany.
Right, so we're in Germany. And we're having our Friday night. I would leave my job, he would leave his, or we would meet at this little Italian restaurant, have our little dinner before we'd go home. Jeff has an uncanny ability. He never forgets a face. So all of you here, he will see you and he will greet you and you will think that you're being accosted by a stranger. But so we're sitting in this booth and a man and a woman and 2 children come walking down through the aisle of the restaurant. And he says to me, "Oh my God, that's Frances Baudet." And I said, "What?" And so he jumps up, and I wouldn't have recognized him in a million years. But I again made a fool of myself. I stood up, I went over to him, and I just wrapped my arms around him, and I would not let go of that man. And I'm sure his kids and his wife were like, "What's going on?" So yeah, that was beautiful. And he went on to become a 3-star Marine general.
No, Army general.
Oh, did I say he was a Marine? No, he's an Army guy. I'm sorry. He's a 3-star Army general. Anyway, I could have told you back then, this guy was destined for good things. He was a great guy.
And how about the woman who helped you?
Hala, I never saw her again. I mean, I wish we had lived in that age where we were connected like we are now. I know, I heard through secondary sources that she ended up in Michigan somewhere for a while. And then I ran into somebody on a plane in Ethiopia 10 years ago when I was assigned to Kenya, and he knew the family. And so I kind of got brought up to speed a little bit, but she got out. She went on. Yeah, she did. She got out. Yes.
I'm intrigued by when you were saying you'd go from home to home in the compound, and there were these soldiers on the roof that were protecting you. But how did you do that without thinking a bullet could be coming down and shooting me and my boys as we're scurrying from place to place? I mean, you just had to do it.
Yeah, I think that it was just, I don't think those guys on the roof would let anybody, I mean, yeah, stray bullet from some miles away perhaps, or however those things happen. But I don't know, we just kind of had to do it.
You felt some sense of
I felt
safety
some
that
sense
you
of
could do
security
that.
that we could do that. And we did scurry. We scurried.
I think we're going to need to wrap it up. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.